Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees and here are today's top stories. The government's controversial policing bill is passed in the Commons, one step closer to becoming law. Repeat burglars, robbers and thieves are to be tagged with GPS trackers. And Uber agrees to pay its workers at least the national living wage, plus holiday pay and pensions. The government's new crime bill is one step closer to becoming law. MPs backed the legislation on Tuesday night. Here's NTD's Jane Well with more.
MPs backed the government's new crime bill 359 to 263 in its second reading, a majority of 96. This massive piece of new crime legislation includes longer sentences and gives more powers to the police. The bill includes dozens of new measures, including a maximum of 2 years for assaulting an emergency worker, widening laws to tackle abusive adults in positions of trust, life in prison for people who've murdered children, and up to 10 years for criminally damaging a memorial. But it's under particular scrutiny for its rules around protests. The legislation says police could prosecute activists for causing serious annoyance and restrict the length of protests and noise levels. Labour voted against the legislation, while Conservatives didn't vote against it. Some expressed unease about the widened rules around protests, like former Prime Minister and Home Secretary Theresa May.
I absolutely accept that the police have got certain challenges, for example, when people glue themselves to vehicles or the gates of Parliament. But freedom of speech is an important right in our democracy. However annoying or uncomfortable sometimes that might be. And I know there will be people who will have seen scenes of protests and will have said, why isn't the government doing something? To which the answer, in many cases, may simply be because we live in a democratic, free society.
The Home Secretary says laws should be reformed because of significant changes in protest tactics in recent years. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
In a world-first scheme, some burglars and thieves will need to wear GPS tags for up to a year after being released from prison. It's a government move to crack down on neighbourhood crime.
The government will fit prolific burglars, robbers and thieves with GPS tags. It's a world's first scheme to prevent reoffending. Those who were jailed for 1 year or more will get them automatically after release. They need to wear them 24/7 for up to 12 months. Minister of Crime and Policing Kit Malthouse said, "Tagging these prolific offenders so we know where they are 24 hours a day should be powerful persuasion to change their ways and help police find and charge them if they don't." After a crime takes place, police will then be able to check the location history of tagged individuals. The government said more than half of those convicted of theft and burglary will reoffend within a year. The scheme will launch in 6 police force areas next month. 13 more will follow in the autumn.
MPs and human rights lawyers raise concerns that lockdown laws are curtailing the right to protest. It follows controversy over the way police have managed recent protests amid the lockdown. Here's NTD's Jane Well with the story.
Officers face criticism over the way they've handled protests during lockdown. But the root of the issue is the lockdown measures, says this Conservative Member of Parliament.
This House criminalised the freedom of protest. This House, us. Not Dame Cressida, not the Metropolitan Police. We did. We criminalised the freedom to protest collectively. We are up to our eyeballs in this. Does the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, agree with me that now is the time to decriminalise freedom of protest? Not tomorrow, not next week, but this afternoon, this evening. Let's get people back on the streets. Let's allow people to get things off their chest again. Protest is a safety valve.
The Home Secretary responds that pandemic restrictions should continue to be followed. She said that the freedom to protest is the cornerstone of our democracy, but large gatherings are not allowed during the pandemic. Members of Parliament are due to have a vote before Easter on extending the Coronavirus Act for another 6 months. Barristers like Salish Mehta are concerned about people's rights, such as the right to protest, being taken away through emergency legislation.
COVID-19 has been often rightly used by governments to limit and restrict the freedoms that people have for the common good. But it's also been used in a number of countries as a cover to take power from ordinary people, take away their rights and be given to the state and to be deposited within the state. And that includes not just the rights to protest and demonstrate, but also personal rights about your image, the number of cameras, what happens to the information, the track and trace information, what eventually will happen to that.
The government's new crime legislation that passed its second reading in the Commons includes changes to protests. Police would have the power to restrict the times of the protest and noise levels, with those rules applying to demonstrations of one person. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
UK companies have told a House of Commons Select Committee that they still can't guarantee their supply chains are free from forced labour. Ethnic Uyghurs in China's western Xinjiang region are the most widely publicised group that have been targeted for forced labour. NTD's Patrick Hayden has the details.
UK MPs are appalled that British companies still cannot guarantee that their supply chains are free from forced labour in China. The Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee says failures in the UK government contributed to the problem. They also conclude that a lack of transparency in the supply chain makes resolution a challenge. The investigation focused on China's Xinjiang region, which has long been known as one of the main targets of forced labour by the Chinese regime. The committee's report proposes to amend and strengthen the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. Boohoo, H&M, TikTok, North Face and Nike testified before the committee. Disney declined but provided a written statement. The committee says it's disappointed that sanctions have not yet been imposed on Chinese officials implicated in human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And given that the US has imposed sanctions, it says the UK should do the same. Patrick Hayden, NTD News.
Did the Scottish National Party leadership interfere with the sexual harassment investigation into former First Minister Alex Salmond? A Conservative MP says he has evidence that it did.
David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, used parliamentary privilege to accuse the SNP of meddling in the probe. Speaking in the House of Commons on Tuesday, he said SNP officials had made a concerted effort to encourage complainants to come forward. Davis also suggested that First Minister Nicola Sturgeon knew about the complaints earlier than she had acknowledged under oath. Sturgeon's spokesman dismissed the allegations.
Uber agrees to pay its 70,000 workers at least the UK minimum wage. This after drivers fought off an appeal by Uber at the Supreme Court in February. But issues still remain. NTD's Neil Wardrow brings the story.
A win for Uber drivers as they now have some guarantees, holiday pay, pensions and at least the national minimum wage for over 25s after expenses. But the new workers' agreement doesn't include waiting time between passenger bookings. The Supreme Court press summary said drivers were working for Uber during any period when the driver was logged into the Uber app, ready and willing to accept trips. The lead claimants in the 2016 tribunal case against Uber said in a statement that Uber drivers will still be shortchanged to the tune of 40 to 50%. Uber's Northern and Eastern Europe regional manager says drivers will be at least 15% better off after the changes if they opt into the pension plan. And on average, drivers earn an hourly rate of £17 in London. Uber says it is not expecting to raise fare prices at the current time. Professor Len Shackleton says that is nonsensical.
Clearly, Uber are facing higher costs. And if they're not going to pass these on in the short run, at least, drivers, then they're going to come from the passenger. They come from the passenger in two ways, I think. One, in terms of higher prices, but also, I think, in reduced availability of cars.
He says worrying signals are being sent out to the gig economy as a whole, and it's shackled with regulations and higher costs.
I think this is a very difficult message to send out at the moment when we're facing really the biggest employment challenge in decades. And anything which makes it more expensive to hire workers, makes it more difficult to hire workers is bad news, I think.
British Business Minister Kwasi Kwarteng says Uber's decision should be welcomed. He says, quote, "The new phase of our economy should be about protecting workers' rights, driving higher standards, driving new technologies." More litigation in the gig economy is forecast. Rival taxi service Addison Lee and food delivery firm Deliveroo have both been subject to legal action over workplace rights. Neil Woodrow, NTD News, Epsom, Surrey.
Up next, the UK will stockpile more nuclear warheads and use them as a deterrent against cyber threats. That and more when we return. The UK government announced on Tuesday a new nuclear weapon policy to increase stockpile of warheads and to use them as a deterrent for cyber and artificial intelligence threats.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson announces that the government will invest an extra £24 million in defence. The money will be used to modernise the UK's armed forces and to renew the nuclear deterrent.
The new money will be focused on mastering the emerging technologies that are transforming warfare, reflecting the premium placed on speed and deployment and technical skill.
In an integrated review published on Tuesday, it says the UK will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons, but it states, "However, we reserve the right to review this assurance if the future threat of weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical and biological capabilities, or emerging technologies that could have a comparable impact, makes it necessary." The UK will also increase the stockpile of nuclear warhead from 180 to a maximum of 260, a rise of 40%. A fleet of 4 Dreadnought-class nuclear submarines will replace the current Vanguard-class submarines in the 2030s, expected to cost £31 billion. In order to maintain the deterrent, the UK will not give public figures for the country's stockpile, deployed warhead or deployed missile numbers. The review also states the UK's nuclear weapons are operationally independent and only the Prime Minister can authorise their use. We would consider using nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances of self-defence, including the defence of our NATO allies.
North Korea has directed its first public statement to the US since Biden took office. It came from the sister of the North Korean leader. Biden officials say North Korea has not responded to their requests for dialogue.
North Korea greets the new U.S. administration with a threat, saying, quote, "If it wants to sleep in peace for the coming 4 years, it had better refrain from causing a stink at its first step." That's from Kim Yo-jong. She's the influential sister of the North Korean leader. She says U.S. and South Korea joint military exercises are a threat to North Korea. The U.S. and South Korea hold the exercises every year. The statement comes as high-level Biden officials arrive in Japan. They're there to discuss security in the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the Biden administration wants to talk with North Korea. He says they have been trying for a month.
To reduce the risks of escalation, we reached out to the North Korean government through several channels, starting in mid-February, including in New York. To date, we have not received a response from Pyongyang.
Blinken says the Biden administration wants to work with allies to create safety and security in the region.
We're united in the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, where countries follow the rules, cooperate whenever they can, and resolve their differences peacefully.
Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are heading to South Korea for official talks Wednesday. Kim Yo-jong says she will watch the, quote, attitude and actions of the South Korean authorities. She says that will determine what actions they'll take against their rival.
The US is on pace to encounter the most migrants attempting to illegally cross the border in 2 decades. That's according to the head of US Homeland Security. He's also defending the Biden administration's handling of the influx. NTD's Grace Cotter has the story.
Alejandro Mayorkas, head of Homeland Security, acknowledged on Tuesday that the number of migrants illegally entering the U.S. has spiked during President Joe Biden's first 2 months in office. And he says we can expect a whole lot more. In a statement, he said, "We are on pace to encounter more individuals on the southwest border than we have in the last 20 years. Mayorkas also defended the Biden administration's response to the situation at the border, which many have described as a growing crisis, including Democrat Senator Joe Manchin. But despite the growing influx and FEMA's deployment to deal with the overwhelming number of unaccompanied youths, both the White House and Mayorkas have avoided using the term crisis."
Does FEMA's arrival at the border mean that the administration feels what is happening down at the border is a disaster?
I know that we always get into the fun of labels around here, but I would say our focus is on solutions. And
Mayorkas says the situation at the southwest border is difficult. He says they're focusing on the path forward, but didn't list any changes to immigration policy. Republicans say Biden's moves to rescind Trump-era immigration policies essentially served as a welcome mat for illegal immigrants. But Mayorkas is instead blaming the Trump administration for the situation at the border. Mayorkas says, "Our goal is a safe, legal, and orderly immigration system that is based on our bedrock priorities: to keep our borders secure, address the plight of children as the law requires, and enable families to be together." He noted that he himself was brought to the U.S. as an infant by his parents, who believed in the hope of America. He said many more families arriving have the same hope. But a number of politicians, including Democrat Representative Vicente Gonzalez, are warning of the dangers the immigrants face making the journey, including sexual assault and extortion by the cartels, which are only becoming more empowered by and even fanning the influx. Grace Coulter, NTD News.
Ofgem is proposing automatic annual refunds. It wants to make energy companies repay customers any overcharges they have made to monthly direct debit on the anniversary of their contracts, starting next year. Currently, providers hold overcharged surplus funds in the billions, and refunds are only returned on request and can take months. Jonathan Brearley, Chief Executive of Ofgem, says this is an important step in making the retail energy market fairer for consumers at a time when many are facing financial hardship. And in other news, Chinese state media is criticizing Kohler and BMW for using facial recognition in their stores. On Monday, it claimed they could be violating new privacy rules because they didn't ask for permission first. NTD's Patrick Hayden reports.
Chinese state TV or CCTV criticized Kohler and BMW Monday for using facial recognition technology in its stores in China. State media says they might be violating China's new privacy rules, which came into effect this year. The companies allegedly didn't get permission from shoppers to use the technology. The accusations came in an annual CCTV broadcast marking Consumer Rights Day that often complains about foreign companies. The Chinese regime uses facial recognition to monitor its population through millions of video cameras. Chinese companies have exported this technology, prompting complaints they might be helping oppressive governments. Kohler said Tuesday it would stop using the technology. It also said it doesn't store information about its customers. A post on its social media account read, "We sincerely apologize to customers." BMW said dealers cited by CCTV are Chinese-owned and not controlled by the German automaker. Patrick Hayden, NTD News.
The European Union is saying no to Chinese-made vaccines. Chinese-made vaccines are expected to be excluded from the EU's Vaccine Passport certification program. They are not approved by the European Medicines Agency. Transparency is the main concern. China's 4 vaccine makers have not published detailed data on their clinical trials. Israeli archaeologists have discovered a trove of artifacts, including fragments of a biblical text. It's the biggest discovery of its kind in the area in over 60 years.
The Israeli Antiquities Authority is overseeing a survey of a 100-kilometre bank of desert cliffside caves. On Tuesday, they presented findings, the like of which haven't been seen for decades.
A survey on this scale was never conducted in the Judean desert. We surveyed more than 100 kilometers of the cliffs of the Judean desert, and you can see the results.
Their discoveries include ancient coins, a 6,000-year-old partially mummified skeleton of a child, and an intact woven basket about 10,500 years old, they say is likely the oldest in the world. Most importantly, they found about 2,000-year-old text fragments that bear biblical verse. They match a scroll discovered in 1947 by local Bedouin, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So these are new pieces of the puzzle, and we can add them to our greater picture of the period and of the text. And even though these pieces are small, they did give us some new information that we did not know before.
The text fragments were found in what is known as the Cave of Horrors, where years ago ancient skeletons of Jewish rebels were uncovered. About a dozen caves thought to be likely hiding places were fully excavated.
A new development in the dispute between Facebook and news publishers in Australia. The tech giant has agreed to pay NewsCorp Australia for news content from its local providers.
Facebook said it's reached a deal with Rupert Murdoch's NewsCorp in Australia on Tuesday. In a statement, NewsCorp CEO Robert Thomson called the deal a landmark in transforming the terms of trade for journalism and said it would have a material and meaningful impact on our Australian news businesses. Facebook's one-week blackout in Australia last month sparked a storm of criticism, as the shutdown also affected not only news, but emergency services and public health pages. But the social media giant ultimately dropped its ban when Australia agreed to soften some parts of the new regulations. Like Facebook, Google had also objected to the new laws and threatened to withdraw from Australia. But it changed tack and signed deals with most media outlets, including NewsCorp, in the days leading up to the law. TV broadcaster and newspaper publisher Seven West Media previously said it intends to strike a Facebook deal, and rival 9 Entertainment announced Tuesday it had signed a letter of intent as well. A Facebook spokesperson declined to comment on the 9 negotiations.
Now more states in the US are standing up against Google. 5 attorney generals are joining a Texas antitrust lawsuit against the tech giant.
Our coalition is going after Google for its anti-competitive practices that eliminate their competition for online display advertising. We believe the free market, not a monopolist, should decide how internet ads are offered. We're also suing Google for its unlawful secret price-fixing agreement with Facebook.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton led the effort and filed the lawsuit in December last year. He filed an amended complaint on Monday alleging Google of deceptive practices. Attorneys general from Florida, Nevada, Alaska, Montana, and Puerto Rico are now joining a coalition of 10 states in a lawsuit against Google. That brings the total number of plaintiffs to 14 states and 1 territory.
New allegations have surfaced in this case. Despite promising users that text messages and WhatsApp are end-to-end encrypted, Google holds the encryption keys to billions of WhatsApp texts backed up on the Google Drive. Right now, this company collects around 7,000 data points on each user.
Arkansas, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah are also part of this coalition. Paxton says if they win this lawsuit, Google will be made to return digital footprints to its users and pay hundreds of billions in financial penalties. Texas is coming for you, Google, Paxton says. Reporting by Allison Lee, NTD News.
500 drones flew above Dublin and created a dazzling light display for St. Patrick's Day. The purpose-built drones formed into different patterns and changed colours. In a show called Orchestra of Light, the display over some of Dublin's most iconic landmarks incorporated drone animations by festival designer Aidan Grinnell. The event was co-organised by Tourism Ireland and aims to promote Ireland as a destination. That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Lees.